of that supply comes from Iran itself. Chinese companies are deeply embedded across the region. They have financed ports, refineries, pipelines, desalination plants and energy projects. Chinese tech giants like Huawei, Alibaba and Tencent have major operations in Dubai. Chinese banks are funding massive LNG projects in Qatar. Chinese investors also operate terminals at Haifa port in Israel and Khalifa port in the UAE. But as missiles and drones hit ports, energy facilities and infrastructure, these investments are suddenly exposed. So today the question is bigger than the geopolitics. Can China protect its economic empire in West Asia? I'm joined by Professor Swaran Singh of JNU and Anuksha Saxena, Staff Research Analyst, Indo-Pacific Studies Program, the Takshashila Institution. Professor Swaran Singh, I have laid out these details of the Chinese infrastructure being targeted. Do you think that is also part and parcel of the larger Iran theatre?
Absolutely, indeed. If you remember, for about a decade plus, once fracking technology was available and the United States became net exporter of oil, it gradually lost interest in West Asia, and that is where Chinese have gradually expanded their footprint. You did mention a good number of examples of infrastructure, of course, in terms of supply chain network and also military supplies. To ultimately, wield influence, use 5G networks as part of communications in the region. So it had enormously invested in the region as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and had become gradually influential enough to, strike a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran and so on. And now it seems with the United States coming back with full force, in that sense, reviving that petrodollar ecosystem potentially in this entire region is impacting China's stakes in the region in multiple ways beyond just this region being source of China's energy, Iran being its very closely cultivated country, just like Venezuela. So in that sense, China is impacted in multiple ways, but China is mixing its response in showcasing the principled approach, talking about assassination of Ayatollah being unacceptable, talking about Iran's territorial integrity, sovereignty to be respected. To now today in a press conference at National People's Congress, Wang Yi did not name Israel and United States.
Correct.
And made a broad mention of this war should not have happened. He mentioned principles of coexistence, etc., which could be partly driven by the sense that they are going to host President Trump soon. There are few and far voices now in China that are saying should they actually be hosting President Trump in that sense. So China is gradually feeling in a tight spot to take a very measured approach of not directly confronting President Trump, but also showcasing its concerns. That it is definitely receiving a hit in terms of how the whole region is in turmoil and energy supplies have come to a complete halt. It's not a hit on Chinese economy because, for example, Iran is only 1% of China's international trade. But in that sense, long-term investment,
strategic
so
interests.
At the strategy of China, that is definitely hit by what is happening right now in the region.
Okay. Anushka, my question to you is, do you think that China will behave like US, the way US would have responded in case of its own interests would have been heard in any other part of the country? Or China will behave differently as a state?
Right. Thank you. So I think we have to really look at what we're talking about when we start comparing China and the US's reactions. If we're talking about the US committing to, say, come to Taiwan's defense in a formal defense treaty, in the form of a formal defense treaty, then it isn't necessary that China will be invoked to take over Taiwan or attempt an invasion, but we will definitely see an aggressive response because Taiwan, let's say, is a non-negotiable and a domestic issue in of course Xi Jinping and the CPC's conception. But if we're looking at something like the US in the form of a naval coalition blockading the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca, I'm not necessarily convinced that that is going to lead China to respond with the full force of its PLA Navy or even its PLA ground forces. In fact, I think as China's response to the current hostilities has shown, and it is evidence enough to say that China both acknowledges and then subsequently exercises very limited interests in the West Asian ecosystem and context. And so, as far as its economic interests are secure, it's unlikely that we're going to see such aggression and such use of military force as perhaps the US has exercised, not just in contexts which are immediate to its periphery or its geographic scope, but also far and wide. So we're not expecting that kind of a response from China unless the issue is that of Taiwan.
So, why is this response different? You know, Venezuela closely in alliance with China. Iran was part of the Chinese-Russian sphere of influence. But why is China's response so different? What is your assessment?
Yeah,
that is a question for, I'll come to you, Anushka. That's a question for Professor Swaran Singh. Why is the Chinese response so different?
Thank you. Because China is civilizationally different, and they have the Sun Tzu kind of mindset of always going in for indirect approach and not confronting the enemy directly in that sense. So they will continue to work behind the scenes, trying to hollow their adversaries over a period of time. So in this case, for example, in strikes with Iran, Chinese also understand that this makes United States deeply engaged. 40% of their naval forces are in that region engaged with Iran. And that would simply mean that they are distracted from Taiwan. So Chinese get a free hand, may not directly attack Taiwan, but they will sort of push forward their engagement-driven kind of strategy in gradually co-opting Taiwan into the mainland, etc. So they look at sort of a very, very indirect way of dealing with their challenges in that sense. So even now, for example, Chinese are in communication with Tehran. I believe they are even communicating Tehran that they should not block Strait of Hormuz because that is significant for China's energy supplies. So they will operate without, directly confronting United States. That I think in Chinese mindset will be foolhardy to directly confront United States. So they will let United States continuously get engaged in the region. Of course, Iran is also not immediate neighbor of China, so it's not threatening Chinese boundaries immediately. It's not attack on China's immediate periphery in that sense. But yes, its investments, its long-term influence, engagement with the region is getting dented because Chinese are not openly standing by, in going and protecting. In fact, their military assets, military exports will get impacted because Chinese missiles obviously are not really very helpful in case of defending Iran against Israeli or American attacks. So yes, there is a dent on its potential influence and exports, etc. But whatever the push comes to shove, Chinese are not going to militarily engage United States. They will continuously like to ensure that United States continuously goes adrift in their relative decline in global leadership, which is happening. Trump is actually helping Beijing in that sense of distancing from international, institutions. Norms,
you were talking about the Wang Yi. This is the quote which is running on the channel: turning away from each other risks miscalculation. This is what he is saying. And he's saying misjudgment can push nations towards conflict. So which means that there will be a different position, Chinese position.
Indeed, Wang Yi, in fact, has repeatedly been citing some of the ancient sages of China also to underline the same sense of what he calls military or war instruments being only destructive and dangerous for humanity. In that sense, they are not good for anyone. So he's clearly indicating China positioning itself in a sense that it's not going to use military force, whether it is in case of Taiwan or it is in case of protecting any of its close friends. We have seen it has definitely learned lessons from a very close ally, Venezuela. Bulk of Venezuelan oil was also going to Chinese in that sense. And China was benefiting from Russia, Iran, Venezuela supplying cheap oil in that sense. So, they are learning lessons how to deal with reality, but they're not going to do things that are not quintessentially Chinese in that sense.
Okay. Anushka, you wanted to come in?
Sure. Yeah, I think another important fact or kind of context to acknowledge here is that there is a question of capability at play.
Okay.
And the reason why Chinese response to Iran or Venezuela or any other similar conflict that can play out in the future is that there is limited capability and not just intent. And of course Wang Yi or the foreign or the Chinese foreign ministry's decision to assign a quote unquote special envoy for mediation in the Middle East, all of these are attempts at the Chinese explaining that the limited role that we want to play in West Asia is that of a mediator. And the same thing played out when there was a Saudi deal that was struck in the past. That normalization was something, again, the Chinese said that they had a role to
This is
play.
rich coming from China, where it is believed that the power flows from the barrel of the gun. For them to say that they only want to play mediators in West Asia, I really don't know what to say.
Domestically, sure. Domestically, the PLA is the army's party and power flows from the barrel of a gun. And which is why any issue that would be deemed as pertinent to domestic and national security, you will see China responding much too much aggressively. But for all the pomp and show of their military might, and of course all the arms sales that they think builds their defense capacity in one way or the other, the response in some of these conflicts you're going to see is going to be very, very muted.
I think that's a very important point, Professor Swaran Singh. It's the capability part. The American operations both in Venezuela and Iran also exposes China's vulnerabilities in terms of their capability to do any military action across the globe. They might be very strong in defending, the territory or in their immediate neighborhood, but it also shows the limit of the global military outreach of the Chinese state.
There is no doubt that United States is notches ahead in terms of both scale and advancedness of military power that it has. But remember, Chinese had walked into Korea in 1950s against the United States only. So it also depends on how they perceive their national interests being at stake here. So same United States getting into Taiwan, for example, have repeatedly drawn very different response. We have seen how the visit of Nancy Pelosi, I think in August of 2022, was responded by Chinese by the largest military exercise, virtually a blockade of Taiwan at that time. So it is also important to understand that when Chinese see that their core interests are challenged, whether in South China Sea or in case of Taiwan, then of course their response is definitely going to be different. But they don't want to really stretch that argument to go and protect faraway countries where they don't think that it is directly impinging on their national existence or core national interests. So I don't want to clearly say that Chinese are guided only by sense of inferiority in terms of their military capability, in terms of technology.
Is it correct to say
and
that?
the saying that
Sir, is it correct to say that when the world is distracted, China becomes militarily adventurous in its neighborhood?
That's an excellent point, both for its economic development and for its military prowess. Chinese look at opportunities when the challenge is adrift, is not facing China directly. So when United States got involved in Gulf wars, for example, in early 1990s, that was the time Chinese GDP was hitting at 13% growth rate, which was overheating of economy at that time. So Chinese might look at this as well. If this war goes on for a couple of years, Chinese will look at this as an opportunity to focus on economic growth and military prowess and modernization and so on. Because ultimately they are looking at 2049 in that sense of becoming equal to United States. So they are not in a hurry. They do think long term in that sense. So they are not trying to deal with the United States by directly confronting United States, particularly when their core interests are not involved here. But to say that they will never confront the United States, I think that may not be perfectly the correct thing to say.
So Anushka, can we say that they have chosen not to confront the United States now? They will choose their time to confront the United States of America.
Yeah, I think there are two ways to look at that assessment. I think one is that I think today why they're not choosing to confront the United States is again a mix of both how harmful they think the American intervention in Iran is to their own national interest, and of course the capability and their assessment of whether or not there is a need to expend resources here. Clearly, on all of these fronts, the Chinese are telling themselves it's not worth it, right? And it's not their fight, which is again very characteristic of the Chinese nature of war fighting and military doctrine. But if we also have to make the case as to when the Chinese would think it's the right time to confront the US, or when they would want to confront the US, that again will have to be a case by case assessment. But most likely it will depend on whether.
And this is
or
knowing
not
very well. This is knowing very well that they have actually invested in the basic infrastructure of West Asia. Basic stuff, power grids. Khalifa port, Chinese. Haifa port, Chinese. Desalination plants in Saudi Arabia, Chinese. Power grid in UAE, Chinese.
Right, and yet again in this I could make the case that it's not actually American actions but Iranian actions that are leading to the stabilization of the destabilization of these investments, right? Essentially, again, China has a very tight rope to walk here. The dilemma from all the elite opinion from official statements that is very clearly evident is that they both have to support Tehran's firm response and commitment to fighting this attack on their sovereignty, and yet protect their interests. So they have to, basically they're victims of their own hypocrisy. So they're walking a very tight rope, right? So again, in the future, if they have to choose when to confront the US, it has to be based on the US's decision and the US's investment of military might in a certain goal. Of course, like I said, Taiwan is an exception, but maybe if it comes to DPRK and South Korea today, or even if it comes to the Philippines, most likely Chinese response or Chinese decision to confront the US will depend on
for China watchers, last 10 years it's about China, their very aggressive Twitter handles, aggressive Chinese diplomats, China, overbuilding on the reef, China in South China Sea. And when this Venezuela and Iran happens, there is no China. So people are looking at China very differently now, and especially in context of what China has been doing with the neighbors, whether it was Galwan or whether it has been South China Sea. And look at the behavior of China right now. So it also exposes the gap in China's military capability. And I think that's where the story is. Thank you both of you for joining me in On Point 3. So this is all I had tonight. I'll see you tomorrow at the same time. Thank you and good night.
हमें स्वस्थ रखने वाली सारी चीजें ज्यादातर शुद्ध होनी चाहिए। सूर्य की किरणें और स्वच्छ पानी, वैसा ही है लाइन अरेबियन डेट्स। और अब लाइन लाइना डेट्स, इसमें फाइबर्स और विटामिन भी कुदरती हैं, जो देता है स्वास्थ्य भी कुदरती।
लायन लाइना प्रीमियम डेट्स,
someone to bring your vision into reality. When human vision meets artificial intelligence, storytelling enters new territory. Two distinct categories: brand films, short films, evaluated by the best of the best, seen by those who shaped the industry, rewarded with a 10 lakh rupee prize pool, celebrated at What India Thinks Today, Delhi.
AI Squared Awards, where artificial intelligence